So we're going back to the moon. Why does that matter? There was a time before my time when the idea of space travel felt exhilarating, exciting. It was a cultural phenomenon. People watched rocket launches the way we watch sports finals today, and every kid grew up wanting to be an astronaut. The Apollo missions were making history in the 1960s and 70s, and Apollo 8 in particular was one of the most talked about events in history. And then slowly that feeling faded, and for more than 50 years, nothing really happened. But now we're recreating that moment. With NASA's Artemis program, Artemis II, we're going back to the moon. And for me, this hits something personal. This is exciting. This is an opportunity to bring back excitement in space. I've always loved astronomy. I've always loved space. I've always found it so fascinating. And science fiction is a genre that has always spoken to me on a very deep level. There's a lot of reasons for that. But a big one for me is that sci-fi doesn't just show us possible futures. It reminds us that we're allowed to dream and to ask ourselves about the implications of those dreams as well, which is perhaps just as important. So here are five science fiction books to read as we go back to the moon. So the first one here. On the surface, this book is about a man alone on another planet. He has no rescue coming. There's no dramatic species. There's a series of problems that he has to solve. He has to do it in order. If he doesn't, he's not going to survive. This book is about space, but really it's about discipline and competence and the refusal to panic when everything is falling apart around you. This book asks, if everything went wrong, if everything fell apart, could you keep your head? Would you actually be ready? The book, The Martian by Andy Weir. The themes explored in The Martian, competence as the essential component of heroism, and how one deals psychologically with isolation. It's hard science fiction, so it's awesome too to just delve really deeply into the science of what would actually be required for someone to survive alone on Mars waiting for a rescue mission. And it just reminds us too the fragility of these kind of missions. We don't always think about that. These are not guarantees. So this is an excellent book to read if you haven't already read it, as Artemis II is preparing to circle the moon again. And I'd highly recommend this book. I haven't yet read these other works, so I can't recommend those yet, but The Martian by Andy Weir. The next work here, I don't have a physical copy actually. I listened to this one on audio, but this is an excellent book. The story is about a child taken away from his home, trained and rigorously raised in this isolated environment. He's taught to think faster, to see more than others have seen, and be able to make decisions that nobody else can make. In this future world, battles aren't fought on Earth anymore, they're fought at a distance, and really strategy becomes the core of this. It's everything. But empathy suffers, and it explores themes of what happens with empathy when you're focused on strategy. The question underneath all this, it's very uncomfortable, right? What do people turn into when stakes are sufficiently high? And this book is Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. Um, Themes explored here: manipulation, control, how authority shapes people, the loss of innocence when you're, fighting for survival. Of course, the ethics of war. It's really one of the key things that this is exploring. And another thing, too, is the burden of genius. I think that's a great exploration that you see a lot of times in the chosen one tropes, and you see this a lot in science fiction as well. So, highly recommend this. Next book here. This book is about a society that lives in this vast enclosed world. They have all these traditions, these hierarchies, beliefs, but they've forgotten something important. They've forgotten that they are actually on a journey and that they don't know where they're going. They don't even know where they come from. They've forgotten all the important things. And this really raises questions that are much bigger than, just generic sci-fi tropes. But how long can a mission last before it stops being a mission and becomes mythology, is forgotten? This book is Orphans of the Sky by Robert Heinlein. Heinlein is one of the great fathers of modern science fiction, one of my favorite science fiction writers that got me in to science fiction. Explores themes of the loss of knowledge, when civilization is regressing because it doesn't have context, myth versus reality, closed systems, the danger of forgetting the mission. Really interesting exploration. Not the most famous Heinlein work, probably, maybe people have heard of The Moon is a Harsh Mistress or Starship Troopers, um, or Stranger in a Strange Land is more famous works, but this one I think is highly worth reading, particularly because of its themes and explorations of what happens when we forget what we're doing, where we're going, and really interesting. The next one here was made into a very famous and critically acclaimed movie. It's about this mission that stretches the bounds of human imagination, where humanity is forced to go further than it's ever gone before. Everything has to be controlled, it's rational, it's precise, but then things don't go exactly as you expect. Things start to happen that don't fit into any of those categories and can't really be understood logically or rationally. And sometimes the question in these kind of stories and science fiction in general is not so much about survival, it's about the inability to understand when you transcend, when you go to another level of consciousness, almost like evolution. And we don't know what we're going to encounter out there. They might not think like us. And so this is a theme that is really interesting to ponder. And the book 2001: A Space Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke. Arthur C. Clarke has a lot of other great works that I'll touch on in future videos as well, but I think this is a great place to start if you're really interested in science fiction, in space, in obviously watching the movie too could be a huge benefit. Kubrick does a great job. It's a good film as well, but I do think that the novel actually provides additional context that is really worth reading. Um, and of course, the explanations of the evolution of humanity in this transitional stage, AI, nowadays with HAL and all of that, and how it reflects human flaws too. And then, of course, the unknown. And I think that's really one of the biggest questions of space travel, of science fiction, is trying to grasp, ineffectually, but trying to grasp nonetheless at the unknown. And that's one of the reasons why I love this genre. Um, you know, there's a lot of other books that I could talk about. I could go on all day. Some of the other ones that explore the same idea of travel that I really loved, that influenced me. Red Mars by Kim Stanley Robinson, about building a world from scratch from nothing. I haven't read the rest of the trilogy, so I can't necessarily recommend that, but I love his hard sci-fi here and his exploration of uh, different strategies, different goals in terms of colonizing another planet and how that would lead to conflict. And really interesting how that is explored. The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, one of the two probably major fathers of science fiction, along with Jules Verne. Although possibly we'd have to go even further back to Johannes Kepler if we wanted to go really to the beginning of science fiction. And there's other, fantasy tropes even further back that have some precedence. But that's beyond the scope of this video here today. The War of the Worlds is really interesting. When are we being observed? Are there other, alien life forms on other planets? Written in the late 1800s, so really interesting. Dune, of course, by Frank Herbert, sorry. Survival, multi generations of developing civilization. Really, the inspiration in many ways for Star Wars, indirectly, but really interesting. Of course, made into modern feature films now, so that's very popular. Worth reading. Some people don't love the prose because it can be a little bit um, uh, dense, perhaps, the way that he writes, but I actually really enjoyed it. So to each their own in terms of preference. Neuromancer by William Gibson, really important novel in the cyberpunk subgenre, and this one has some really interesting explorations too of the implications of human cyborg kind of interactions, which is an interesting thing as we enter this next era in humanity to explore. So that one's definitely worth reading as well. Rendezvous with Rama. I have to end off with another Arthur C. Clarke pick here. This, encountering truly the unknown. I think he goes even further than in 2001 in terms of the exploration of the unknown in this work, and it's just brilliant. And I have to say, writers like Clarke and Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein, and Isaac Asimov in particular, really the fathers of modern science fiction as we know it, and that genre in the 50s, 60s, 70s. They were really the ones that got me into this genre early on, because they didn't tell stories just about space and stuff. You know, it was a structured narrative about the possible or the inevitable, right? And those the interplay between the possibility and inevitability. the future wasn't fantasy, right? It was something that you could think through. You could see yourself getting there, or what the implications of that would be, other directions we could go. Such a cool thought experiment and way of interacting in the world. And so, I love those guys and have a lot of gratitude and indebtedness to them as well. And that leads us to the last book here. So this one might be one of my favorites of all time. It's not about just a mission. It's not even just about something that happens in one generation, but about civilization over centuries. What happens to humanity when it spreads its tentacles far into space and develops history, politics, and eventually a decline. Now, it's not just a space is the frontier, like a lot of other stories. Space is the setting of this novel. And this is Foundation by Isaac Asimov. And this is really not just one novel too. It's part of a trilogy with other, prequels and sequels as well. So it's a whole world, a whole literary universe of Foundation books. Um, but Asimov's exploration of the fall of civilizations, at galactic scale is just so cool. I mean, honestly, I could nerd out about this for 45 minutes here, but we won't do that. Explorations of determinism versus free will. Can the future be predicted? Right? Can you have psychological ways of understanding? Okay, this is how humans are going to evolve, and these are the precipices. These are the inflection points that will happen at different times. And that's one of the themes throughout this as well. I won't say too much about that because I don't want to spoil anything. Knowledge preservation, when civilization is falling, when Rome falls, it's kind of like the rise and fall of Rome, or the fall and decline of the Roman Empire kind of idea is definitely an influence into this work. Um, and yeah, so the foundations of survival and how to plant those seeds, long-term thinking, right? And I love Asimov as a scientist, science educator, popularizer of fiction, short story writer, novelist. But this, or probably rather the whole Foundation trilogy, is probably, possibly the whole, Foundation universe is probably his magnum opus, And one of the ideas in this book that completely stuck with me is the concept of the city world. I'll just go on this one tangent here. There's a planet Trantor where the entire surface is covered with single continuous city, no oceans, wilderness, anything. It's just layers and layers of infrastructure. And it stretches the entire circumference of the planet. And what's fascinating about this is not just the scale, it's the idea of dependency, right? The world, it can't sustain itself at all. It relies entirely on other planets for food, for resources. It's the center of power, but it's also super duper fragile. And so that's kind of the premise of Foundation, right? Not just space travel, but what happens when a civilization becomes so vast, like too much butter spread out on a lot of bread, too complex to sustain itself. So it starts to collapse under its own weight. And for a long time, it felt like, we stopped looking up. Like the biggest things that we were going to do were already behind us. But now with Artemis, with this program, I think we're stepping back into the story, into history, into space travel. And maybe these books will remind us this. Space was never about where we could go. It's about our willingness to imagine. And so I'd love to, if you made it this far, I'd love to know which of these books captures your idea of space and your imagination. And if you're someone who, still believes the future could be bigger than the present, I write books about this and share original stories on my Substack. It's linked below. Um, because maybe the point of all this isn't just that we're going back to the moon, right? That's exciting. It's awesome. But maybe we're actually ready to imagine again. And that is pretty cool. So, Godspeed to the astronauts on Artemis II, and happy reading to all of you. God bless.